There is a moment in the year 1227, somewhere in the mountains of what is now northern China, that historians still argue about to this day. A man is dying. He is the most powerful human being who has ever lived, the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, a man whose armies have burned cities from the Pacific coast of Asia to the gates of Europe. And he is dying quietly in a military camp, with no monument prepared, no tomb built, no successor fully secured. His name was Genghis Khan, and by his own explicit order, his body would be buried in an unmarked grave so secret that to this day, 800 years later, nobody has ever found it. Historians estimate that his armies were responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 20 and 40 million people, and that his conquests reduced the world's population by as much as 11%. At its height, the empire he founded stretched from the Sea of Japan to the plains of Hungary, encompassing roughly 12 million square miles, nearly a quarter of the entire land surface of Earth. It was, and still is, the largest contiguous empire ever assembled by a single family. And yet within just a few generations, that empire would not simply shrink. It would fracture into pieces, turn against itself, and eventually scatter its ruling bloodline across a continent, from the palaces of Beijing to the steppes of Crimea, from the deserts of Central Asia to the mountains of Afghanistan. Some of his descendants would go on to found new empires of staggering wealth and power. Others would be strangled, drowned, or beheaded by their own cousins. Others still would simply vanish into the general population, their imperial blood diluted generation after generation, until it became, quite literally, one of the most widely shared genetic inheritances on the planet. This is the story of what happened to the family of Genghis Khan after the empire he built began to tear itself apart, because the details of that unraveling are stranger, bloodier, and in some ways more astonishing than the story of the conquest itself. To understand the fall, you first need to understand how fragile the foundation always was. Genghis Khan, born around 1162 with the name Temujin, had done something no one on the Mongolian steppe had ever managed before. He had united dozens of warring, blood-feuding nomadic tribes, the Merkit, the Tatar, the Nayman, the Karet, into a single disciplined fighting force bound not by clan loyalty, but by personal loyalty to him. In 1206, a great assembly of Mongol chieftains, a Kurultai, proclaimed him Genghis Khan, meaning something close to universal ruler. From there, the conquests came with terrifying speed. Northern China fell. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had controlled Persia and Central Asia, was annihilated so thoroughly that entire cities like Merv and Urgench were left as depopulated ruins for generations. By the time Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, likely from injuries sustained falling from a horse while campaigning against the Tangut, though some traditions claim illness or even assassination, he ruled an empire larger than any that had come before it. And he had made a decision that would define everything that followed. Rather than leaving the empire to a single heir in the way of most monarchies, Genghis Khan divided it among his sons and grandsons as appanages, personal territories to be governed under the nominal unity of the empire as a whole. It was a solution born of Mongol tradition, but it planted the seed of every catastrophe that would follow. His third son, Ogedei, was named Great Khan, ruling the empire's core. His eldest son, Joki, who had died shortly before his father and whose paternity had always been quietly disputed within the family, had his territory in the western steppes passed to his own sons, Batu and Orda. His second son, Chagatai, received Central Asia. His youngest son, Toli, received the Mongol homeland itself. For a few decades, under Ogedei and then under Toli's son, Monke, the fiction of a unified empire held. Monke's brother Hulagu marched west and sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the 5-century-old Abbasid Caliphate and establishing what would become the Ilkhanate in Persia. Another brother, Kublai, would go on to conquer the rest of China and found the Yuan dynasty. But when Monke died suddenly in 1259 while campaigning in China, the fragile unity shattered for good. Kublai and his younger brother Arik Boke both declared themselves Great Khan simultaneously, and for the first time in Mongol history, cousins raised armies against cousins. Kublai won that particular war, but he never again controlled the whole empire in anything but name. From that point forward, what had been a single Mongol empire was really four separate, increasingly independent khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe, all ruled by different branches of the same family, and all of them, sooner or later, would collapse. Let's start with the branch that fell first and hardest, the Ilkhanate in Persia. Founded by Hulagu after the sack of Baghdad, the Ilkhanate ruled over a territory stretching from Anatolia to Afghanistan for roughly 80 years. But the dynasty had a structural problem that would prove fatal. Unlike in China, where the Mongol rulers eventually adopted Chinese administrative systems and married into the population over centuries, the Ilkhanate never fully stabilized its succession. Khan after Khan died young, several under suspicious circumstances, and the aristocracy split into rival factions backing different candidates. The last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, took the throne as a child in 1316 and spent his short reign dominated by powerful regional emirs who were really running the show behind him. When Abu Sa'id died in 1335, reportedly poisoned, he left no direct heir. The dynasty simply had no one left to put on the throne. Within a matter of months, the Ilkhanate didn't so much collapse as evaporate, splintering into a chaotic patchwork of rival warlord states across Persia and Iraq that would fight each other for the better part of a century, until a new conqueror named Timur, who was not himself a direct blood descendant of Genghis Khan, but who married into the Chagatai royal line and ruled in the name of puppet Genghisid Khans to legitimize his own conquests, swept through and imposed a new order entirely. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia followed a similarly fractured path. It splintered by the middle of the 1300s into a western half centered around Transoxiana, modern-day Uzbekistan, and an eastern half called Mogolistan, stretching across what is now Xinjiang and parts of Kyrgyzstan. It was in the western half that Timur rose to power in the 1370s, and though Timur ruled as the real authority, he never claimed the title of Khan for himself, always keeping a ceremonial Chinggisid puppet on the throne beside him, because even a century and a half after Genghis Khan's death, his bloodline still carried a kind of sacred political legitimacy that raw military power alone could not replace. That is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. Long after the empire itself had fractured into warring pieces, the mere fact of descent from Genghis Khan remained so potent that ambitious conquerors felt they needed a Genghisid figurehead to rule credibly at all. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, lasted the longest as a unified state, ruling from 1271 until 1368, but its fall was arguably the most humiliating for the family, because it meant losing the very heartland of the empire's greatest conquest. By the 1350s, the Yuan court had grown detached from the population it governed, plagued by court intrigue, catastrophic flooding of the Yellow River, devastating outbreaks of plague, and crushing taxation. Ethnic Chinese rebellions broke out across the south, the most successful led by a former Buddhist monk and beggar named Zhu Yuanzhang. In 1368, his forces marched on the Yuan capital of Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing. The reigning emperor, Togun Temur, made a decision that would define the rest of Mongol history. Rather than staying to fight and likely die in the fall of the city, the way so many other collapsing dynasties had, he gathered his court and fled north into Mongolia, back to the ancestral steppe his great-grandfather Genghis Khan had ridden out of a century and a half earlier. It was, in its own strange way, the empire folding back in on itself, retreating to where it had all begun. Zhu Yuanzhang declared the founding of the Ming dynasty, and Togun Temur died in Mongolia 2 years later, in 1370, still technically claiming the title of Great Khan of a dynasty that, from the perspective of Beijing, simply no longer existed. His descendants continued to rule what historians call the Northern Yuan, a diminished, fractious Mongol state on the steppe, for another 2.5 centuries. But it was a shadow empire, perpetually raided by the Ming, perpetually torn apart by rival Mongol factions, some of whom were not even descended from Genghis Khan at all, but who seized power regardless. The last Khan to actually die, still holding the Genghisid title, Ligdan Khan, died of smallpox in 1634 while fleeing the rising power of the Manchus, who would go on to found the Qing dynasty and absorb the remaining Mongol tribes into their own empire, ending any pretense of independent Genghisid rule in Mongolia for good. But if the fall of the Yuan was a slow bleed, the fall of the fourth and final branch, the Golden Horde in the Russian and Ukrainian steppe, was arguably the most drawn out and the most consequential for the world we live in today. The Golden Horde, ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan's eldest son Joki through his son Batu, dominated Russia for roughly 2.5 centuries, forcing Russian princes to travel to the Horde's capital to receive their thrones as vassals and to pay tribute in what Russian chroniclers would later call the Tatar yoke. But by the 1400s, the same disease that had killed every other branch of the family, fratricidal succession disputes, was tearing the Horde apart from within. It splintered into a set of successor khanates, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Khanate of Siberia, and the Crimean Khanate, each ruled by different branches of the Jochid line, each increasingly independent and increasingly at war with one another. And into that fractured landscape stepped a rising power that the Mongols themselves had once treated as little more than a tribute-paying vassal state, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, conquered the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 after a brutal siege, and the Khanate of Astrakhan 4 years later in 1556. The Khanate of Siberia fell over the following decades to Cossack expansion. One by one, the descendants of Genghis Khan, who had once made Russian princes kneel, were being conquered by those same Russian princes' descendants. Only the Crimean Khanate held out, and it held out for a remarkably long time, surviving as a semi-independent vassal of the Ottoman Empire for over 3 centuries. Its Khans still tracing an unbroken direct male line back to Genghis Khan through Jochi and Batu, the longest continuously reigning branch of the entire dynasty. But even that final branch could not escape the 18th century. Catherine the Great of Russia annexed Crimea outright in 1783. The very last Crimean Khan, a reform-minded ruler named Sahin Jirai, had already been forced to abdicate 2 years earlier under overwhelming Russian pressure, and he fled to Ottoman territory hoping for protection. He did not get it. The Ottomans, suspicious that he might try to use his lingering prestige to destabilize their own control over the region, arrested him and exiled him to the island of Rhodes. In 1787, on Ottoman orders, Sahin Jirai was executed. Think about what that moment actually represents. The last man in the world to hold the title of Khan in an unbroken direct male line from Genghis Khan himself, ruler of an empire that had once stretched from Korea to Hungary, was executed on a Mediterranean island by the order of another empire that had once feared his ancestors above all things on earth. It is one of the quietest, least remembered endings of any ruling dynasty in world history, and it deserves to be far better known than it is. So what actually happened to the ordinary members of the family, the wives, the cousins, the minor princes who were not sitting on any of these 4 thrones when they collapsed? The honest answer is that their fates were as varied as the empire itself had been vast. Some fought to the death defending crumbling khanates and were killed in battle or executed by rival claimants, which was in many ways the single most common fate for any male member of the ruling line across all 4 branches. Mongol succession disputes were notoriously, almost ritually brutal, and it was not unusual for a new Khan's first act upon taking power to be the systematic execution of every rival claimant he could find, including nephews, half-brothers, and infant cousins, precisely because Genghisid blood was considered so politically dangerous that even a distant claim could become the rallying point for a rebellion decades later. Other family members simply assimilated. In China, many descendants of the Yuan imperial line who stayed behind after 1368 were absorbed into the general population, some changing their surnames, some intermarrying with Han Chinese families, their imperial ancestry becoming a private family memory rather than a political fact. In Central Asia and the Middle East, the Genghisid nobility that had ruled the Ilkhanate and Chagatai Khanate largely melted into the broader Turco-Persian aristocracy that succeeded them, their bloodline surviving not as a ruling dynasty, but as a mark of prestige that local rulers continued to invoke for centuries because it still carried weight. And then there is the story that connects the fall of the Mughal Empire to one of history's most extraordinary second acts. Timur's own dynasty, the Timurids, who had ruled Central Asia by keeping Genghisid puppet Khans on the throne beside them, eventually splintered under the same pressures that had destroyed everyone before them, Rival princes disputed successions, invading Uzbek tribes pushing in from the north. One of the last Timurid princes, a young man descended from Timur on his father's side, and crucially from Genghis Khan himself on his mother's side through the Chagatai line, was pushed out of his ancestral territory around Fergana in Central Asia in the early 1500s. Rather than accepting obscurity, he gathered what forces he could and marched south into India. In 1526, at the Battle of Panipat, he defeated the much larger army of the Sultan of Delhi and founded what would become one of the wealthiest and most magnificent empires in human history, an empire whose very name is simply the Persian word for Mongol. For over 3 centuries, its emperors ruled a subcontinent, building treasuries that made European monarchs look poor by comparison, all of it carried forward, at least in part, by the diluted but unmistakable royal blood of Genghis Khan, still finding new empires to build 8 generations and thousands of miles removed from the man who started it all. Beyond that dynasty, the Genghisid legacy scattered even further into the fabric of Eurasian history in ways that are still being discovered. In the mountainous regions of central Afghanistan, the Hazara people have long maintained an oral tradition connecting their ancestry to Mongol garrisons left behind during the 13th century invasions, a claim that modern genetic studies have found some, though contested, support for. Across Kazakhstan and other parts of the former Golden Horde territory, a hereditary social class known as the Tory survived for centuries, a group whose members traced direct descent from Genghis Khan through Jochi and who held special legal and social status under both the later khanates and, informally, well into the era of the Russian Empire. Even in Mongolia itself, where the Qing dynasty absorbed the last vestiges of Genghisid political power in the 17th century, the old aristocratic families known as Taij continued to be recognized and recorded as descendants of the imperial line straight through into the 20th century, their titles stripped of any real power but their genealogies carefully preserved, a paper empire outliving the real one by nearly 400 years. The most astonishing coda to this entire story, though, did not come from historians at all. It came from geneticists. In a landmark study from 2003, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, researchers analyzing Y chromosome data across a huge swath of Asia identified a genetic signature present in an extraordinarily high percentage of men across a region stretching from northeastern China to Central Asia and into parts of the Middle East. A pattern of descent so widespread and so concentrated in exactly the territories once ruled by the Mughal Empire that the researchers concluded it very likely traced back to a single man living roughly 1,000 years ago, and that man's descendants, the study estimated, could plausibly number as many as 16 million people alive today, roughly 0.5% of the entire male population of the world. While the study could not conclusively prove the ancestor was Genghis Khan specifically, rather than one of his immediate male relatives, the geographic and chronological fit was so precise that it remains, to this day, the most widely cited piece of evidence that the bloodline of the man who conquered a quarter of the known world never actually disappeared at all. It simply stopped being royal. It dissolved into the general population of an entire continent, carried forward silently in the DNA of millions of ordinary people who have absolutely no idea that they carry it. There is something worth pausing on here about how differently this collapse unfolded compared to every other fallen dynasty in this kind of story. The Romanovs were executed as a single family in a single basement on a single night. The Ottomans were expelled as a defined, countable group of 156 people with a clear before and after. The Genghis Khan family's fall was nothing like that. It happened 4 times in 4 separate regions over the course of more than 5 centuries, and it never really finished happening at all because the bloodline simply kept finding new outlets, new empires, new disguises. It was poisoned and abandoned in Persia. It fled into the steppe in China. It was executed on a Mediterranean island in Crimea, and in the same historical breath, it was busy conquering India. No other ruling family in world history has had an ending that was simultaneously so violent and so impossible to pin down, so total in some places and so quietly, invisibly persistent in others. In modern Mongolia, the legacy has undergone its own strange revival. For most of the 20th century, under Soviet-backed communist rule, Genghis Khan was officially treated as a symbol of feudal oppression, his name barely spoken in schools, his statues non-existent. But after the collapse of Soviet influence in 1990, Mongolia underwent what can only be described as a full-scale reclamation of his image. Genghis Khan appears on the national currency. Mongolia's main international airport was renamed after him. A colossal 130-foot stainless steel statue of him on horseback, one of the largest equestrian statues on Earth, now stands on the steppe outside Ulaanbaatar, gleaming in the sun exactly where legend claims he once found a golden whip. The Mongolian government does not claim any restored monarchy. There is no throne to reclaim, no family council issuing statements the way there is for the Habsburgs or the Ottomans. What survives instead is something more diffuse and in some ways more powerful. A national identity almost entirely rebuilt around the memory of a single man whose direct political dynasty stopped existing anywhere in the world more than 2 centuries ago, but whose name still organizes the pride of an entire nation. So what actually happened to the family of Genghis Khan? The truthful answer is that it did not fall the way empires usually fall. It did not end. It diffused. It scattered itself across 4 collapsing khanates over 3 centuries, lost its thrones one by one to poison, plague, siege, and execution, watched its final legitimate ruler killed on a Mediterranean island in 1787, and then, almost as if in defiance of its own extinction, kept quietly reappearing in the blood of new emperors, Kazakh nobility, Afghan mountain villages, and if the geneticists are right, in the DNA of something like 16 million people scattered across the modern world who will never know it. Most fallen dynasties leave behind a palace, a museum, a handful of surviving descendants who can be interviewed on camera. Genghis Khan's family left behind something closer to a fingerprint smeared across an entire continent, unmistakable if you know exactly where to look, and virtually invisible if you don't. Perhaps that is the most fitting ending imaginable for an empire that was never really built to last as a single unified thing in the first place. A family that conquered a quarter of the world and then, piece by piece, century by century, simply became the world itself. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives into the dynasties that shaped our world. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Should Genghis Khan have divided his empire the way he did, or was its fracture always inevitable? I'll see you in the next one.